Noswaith dda iawn I chi, a chroeso cynnes y digwyddiad mae heno. Braf iawn cael eich cwmni chi. Good evening, warm welcome to you. We are gathered to hear a digital showcase. We've entitled it Dismantling Institutional Racism, Datgymalu, hiliaeth, sefydliadol. We'll send you a link to the recording following the event, and it's important to say that you're very welcome to share that link. Ymunwch Athro Emmanuel Ogbonna. My name's Professor Damien Walford-Davies. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Cardiff University. And I want to start by thanking you, our alumni, staff, donors, friends, and supporters for joining us. You are many thanks for tuning in. And you're here this evening as part of the Cardiff community worldwide, comprising graduates and friends who are supporting the learning and the research of the university, and we're deeply grateful for that. Okay, this evening's research showcase is presented by Professor Emmanuel Ogbonna, Professor of Management and Organisation at Cardiff Business School. Awarded his PhD here at Cardiff in 1990, he has since developed, as many of you know, a distinguished career at Cardiff Business School, where his research interests cut across the fields of organisational culture, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Emmanuel was co-chair of the steering group framing the Welsh Government's Race Equality Action Plan, and we're so proud of his leadership of an enterprise that prompts a meaningful shift, as he himself has said, away from rhetoric, away entirely from rhetoric, towards meaningful cultural change. Cardiff University itself has mapped its race equality initiatives and its planned next steps as part of a newly integrated, newly connected structure for equality, diversity, and inclusion in the institution, one that is meant to clarify governance, leadership, responsibility, and ownership, that important concept of ownership, precisely in order to enable the cultural change that Emmanuel's wider work has been identifying. So I'm delighted that Emmanuel joins us tonight to share with us his work on institutional racism and how we can work to eradicate it from all levels of society. So we'll hear therefore from Emmanuel in a moment, and following his talk, we will open our question and answer session, to which we will be warmly welcoming our guest, Isadora Sinner, who will share her own experiences and insight. Isadora was the Black and Minority Ethnic Students Officer at the University Students' Union last year, and is on the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Division of Psychological Medicine and Clinical Neuroscience at the School of Medicine at Cardiff University. She's currently a PhD student at the School of Medicine, and we're delighted she's joining us this evening. So members of the audience, finally, if you have any questions for Emmanuel and Isadora, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point, and we will get to as many questions as time allows at the end. Okay, enough from me. Emmanuel, a warm welcome. Croeso cynnes I ti. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here today. I would like to share my reflections on some of the work we've been doing here in Wales to eradicate institutional racism. The work we are doing in Wales fits into the research that I and other colleagues in Cardiff Business School are doing as part of our public value mission. I'd like to share my screen now, if I may. Can you all see that? Yeah, okay. I want to start by talking to you briefly about my doctoral work. My PhD was awarded in the area of organizational culture, and this was awarded in 1990. And okay, I think the display is a bit. Yeah, just going to try and get back here and change the display. Just 1 second. Okay. I hope it is better now. So my doctoral work was in the area of organizational culture. And I think you would agree that that is particularly pertinent in relation to race discrimination and racism, because racism is embedded in beliefs, values, and assumptions, and these are at the core of culture, the culture of an organization, or indeed the culture of a society. But these are also expressed through behaviors, which are the manifestations of culture. I've also researched many other aspects of race discrimination in employment, and these are some of the things that have helped to shape the views and the expertise and experience that I have brought into the work with the Welsh government. I should also say that I am trustee and vice chair of Race Council Wales, which is one of the major race equality organizations here in Wales. In early 2020, the First Minister of Wales invited me to chair a subgroup that was established to look into the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on racial and ethnic minority communities. That subgroup carried out its work, and in June of 2020, we concluded that one of the key factors that was contributing to the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and minority ethnic communities was institutional racism. Institutional racism is part of what we are talking about today. Interestingly, unlike in England, the Welsh government accepted that institutional racism was a thing and set about trying to eradicate institutional racism. As part of that, the Welsh government established a steering group to lead the development of a race equality action plan. And again, I was invited to co-chair that steering group with the permanent secretary of the Welsh government, the permanent secretary being the highest ranked civil servant in Wales. That plan will be published very soon. And so this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. I want to begin then by asking the question that you might want to ask. What do we mean by institutional racism? And how do we know when we see institutional racism? Now, Sir William Macpherson, you will remember, defined institutional racism as a collective failure of an organization. I have included society here, my own emphasis, to provide appropriate service and professional service to people because of their color, their culture, or their ethnic origins. So institutional racism in that sense is embedded in mutually reinforcing racialized systems. They are interconnected. They impact on education, on policing, on housing, on healthcare, and so on. Almost every facet of society will become something that is impacted by institutional racism. You might want to know what the evidence is, and there are numerous evidence of institutional racism that we can talk about today. If I just list a few for you, because we don't have a lot of time for today's lecture, if I start off with in society and look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that the pandemic revealed pre-existing inequalities in society that were racialized in many respects. For example, Black and minority ethnic people were up to 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 in comparison with their white counterparts. We know from a BBC investigation that 95% of all doctors that died from the pandemic were from Black and minority ethnic communities. We also know that research established that there were 2 key factors that were impacting on COVID deaths. They were age and then ethnicity. We also know that when we invented the solution to the pandemic, when the vaccine was invented, the first thing we did was to prioritize age, but not ethnicity. If we knew that these were the two key variables that were killing people, then why didn't we prioritize ethnicity at the same time we prioritized age? And that is another sign of institutional racism in that sense, in terms of society. You look at employment and unemployment, the Black and minority ethnic people are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. It doesn't matter whether they have qualifications or whether they don't have qualifications. Black and minority ethnic people lose up to £3.2 billion per year on pay gap. Pay gap that talking about people doing the same job and they are being paid differently. We know from research that the average Black doctor will earn £10,000 less than his or her white counterpart, and the average Black nurse will earn £2,700 less than their white counterparts. We know that in 2022, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. Asian women up to 2 times more likely to die in childbirth than in comparison to their white counterpart. This is in 2022. We look at education. There's a 13% gap, education gap in that sense, between the likelihood of white students and Black and ethnic minority students getting a top degree from a university. So you may still want to know why more evidence. You may want to see more evidence of this institutional racism. I won't blame you. The civil servants that I worked with on the socioeconomic subgroup report wanted more evidence, and I provided more evidence. There's little known research that is conducted annually, little known outside the academic community anyway, that is conducted annually, regularly, on all sorts of areas in relation to attitudes that we hold. British social attitude surveys, conducted by the National Center for Social Research. But the last one on race was in 2017. And this tells us clearly that 26% of people in this country are very prejudiced or a little prejudiced towards people of other races. So we know that these are people who are self-selecting and that are accepting that they are racist towards other people. Imagine then if we actually had people who would say the truth, people who may be racist but think it is not socially acceptable and would not be willing to admit to that to researchers. And you can see that. You look at an European survey at the bottom there, where there were up to 44% of British people who believe that some races or ethnic groups are naturally harder working. If you imagine that, if somebody believes that somebody from a particular ethnic group is not born hardworking, then it's highly unlikely that they are going to want to give them a job. It's highly unlikely that they are going to want to associate with them in anything that is meaningful. It is highly likely that if you think someone is born lazy, that if you're a police officer, you would want to stop them on the street. If you're an academic, you wouldn't want to award them a first-class degree or a top 2-1. There are so many factors that emerge from this, and these are all connected, all linked essentially to the culture of societies. And these are some of the things that make it difficult for us to be able to eradicate institutional racism. It's difficult to eradicate institutional racism because race, in that sense, becomes a convenient marker of distinguishing people, probably the most salient aspect of identity. If you were to ask people where there is a scene of a crime, the first thing they tend to notice will be the race of the people, particularly if the people are different. So it is something that denotes our social status and our legitimacy, our right almost to exist, our right to be wherever we may be. Is determined almost by our race in that sense. And many people are benefiting from this, and the beneficiaries are often unwilling to give these things up. Racism confers privileges to certain groups, which they then see as normal. And if it is normal, then you don't want to mess with it, you don't want to give it up. Racism in that sense becomes ingrained in the systems, in the processes, and the procedures of societies, of organizations, in ways that become taken for granted. They are seen as normal. That is the only way to do things. There is no other way that people understand or recognize. People within it then become quite complacent, and they begin to tell you that they don't even see race. And this is when racism becomes very powerful, when institutions and organizations and individuals tell you that they don't see color. We are colorblind. Race has nothing to do with the decisions that we make. When you hear that, you suddenly realize how easy it is to dismiss the experience of people. Because in everyday life, Black and minority ethnic people are living this experience. Their lived experience is marred by structural and systemic racism, and organizations often don't recognize that. We also struggle to eradicate racism because we fall into this perennial implementation gap. The gap between that which we say we will do and what we actually do. We all have all these good policies and practices. You see it in the last 5-6 years alone. How many reports have we had? We've had the Parker report. We had the report that other people have written, the report that Dame McGregor Smith provided on race. So many reports that people have written. None of them have been implemented because we just do not see the area of race as important enough. And in fact, you look at local authorities. Local authorities have a public, not just local authority, public sector organizations. They all have a public sector equality duty. They are mandated by law to ensure that they do not have discrimination, that they do everything to remove discrimination. When it comes to the area of race, they don't seem to do anything or do much on that. And there has been no implication from doing nothing, from not doing much in the area of race in the past. And that is one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to eradicate racism. And I also believe that one reason we haven't been able to eradicate racism is because we have what I view as incorrect conceptualization or understanding of racism. Traditionally, we've understood race as a dichotomous construct. Somebody is either a racist or a non-racist. But I believe that is too simplistic. If we need to be able to view race as something that occurs in a continuum, where at one end you have the racist and at the other end you have the anti-racist, and non-racist becomes the midpoint of that continuum. And when you do that, what you will see automatically is that non-racism is not a very good position to be. That non-racism is positive in intention, but very passive in action. Non-racists don't do anything. They just go around saying, I am not racist, but they don't understand how complicit they can or they are in the racism that exists around them. In contrast, an anti-racist position is a conscious state, an active state of identifying and eliminating all the barriers that lead to or may lead to racially disadvantaging or differential outcomes. So once we begin to view racism as a continuum, we can see the spread of behaviors that characterize this behavior or value system that we call racism. And we can then begin to see how the only way we can eradicate racism is by going from non-racism to anti-racist position. So how do we do this then? The first thing we do, and what I'm trying to do, is to focus on some of the things we are doing here as part of the Race Equality Action Plan for Wales, an anti-racist race equality action plan for Wales. The first thing is to accept that racism is institutionalized. This is something they struggled with in England, but we're not struggling with it in Wales. In Wales, the Welsh government accepted our report that institutional racism exists in Wales and is a major factor that contributed or is contributing to the disproportionate outcomes from COVID. Racism is not a thing of the past. It has the capacity to mutate. It just changes with generation. There are people that will look at it and say, oh, we don't have racism today. You go back to the 60s and 70s when people were carrying placards saying, go home, Black people and Pakistani people and so on and so forth. We don't have that anymore today, do we? But that's because they are forgetting to understand that the type of racism we have has mutated and will continue to mutate if we don't stop it. The next generation will become worse than this generation. We have to be bold in our approach, and we are bold in our approach here in Wales because we are seeking to develop a zero tolerance attitude towards racism. And what that means is that we are adopting here in Wales an anti-racist approach. We are adopting an anti-racist approach because previous approaches, such as managing diversity, equality, diversity, and inclusion, they've all failed. They've all failed because they have not recognized the unequal or the racialized power structures in society. You cannot start working from today without remembering what has happened to a group of people through their lives and through their histories, how these may have impacted on them and may continue to impact on them. Otherwise, you end up trying to explain any anomalies in outcomes by looking at the deficiencies or the assumed deficiencies of the people. So we blame the victims of racism. We look at them and we say, oh, we have equal opportunity policies. We are managing diversity here. So if they are not succeeding, it's probably because of something they are not doing right. But that is not the case, because what racism has done and continues to do is to sap them of their agencies to be able to do anything and make it very difficult for them to be able to do anything other than to try to work within that system. Some people will succeed within it, but most won't. And even the ones that do have the scars to show for it. Then non-racist, even that position, non-racism, they are susceptible to racist stereotypes. You look at it, most people as they are growing up would have come across several racist stereotypes. They skip these, they store these, they become part of their toolkit, if you like, the framework that fills the gaps in their knowledge so that in times of need, in times of anxiety, they somehow bring these things out and then this become unearthed and then they become the things that guide their behaviors. That's because they are not consciously thinking about racism. So this is why you go on a train in London, a tube train in London, and then an old woman that is sitting down tries to find her wallet or her bag or something because a Black man is coming. Because in her stereotypical image of a Black person is, this person is going to rob me. not knowing whether this person is an investment banker just getting onto the train in bank to go home. But that's not important. What is important is the stereotype itself. And these are the stereotypes that then influence our behaviors. They influence our behaviors so much so that we call them unconscious bias. But unconscious bias is just racism that is sugar-coated anyway. So we don't have to be neutral on racism. We have to adopt that position that is anti-racist, because that is the only time that we'll begin to do something about it. We have to, and we are in Wales, seeking to develop strategies to close the implementation gap, because that is a huge, huge thing. We have to understand that racism is about attitude and behavior. They are learned ways of doing things that are enshrined in values and assumptions. They are a hearts and minds thing, but we also need to understand that it is very difficult to change hearts and minds, which is why in Wales, we are looking to change behaviors with the aim of changing values in the longer terms. You look at similar changes in society and you can see how difficult it is to change hearts and minds. Equal pay would not have been possible today if it were left to hearts and minds. Remember that even members of the cabinet, didn't particularly agree with Barbara Castle in the early 1970s when she was trying to draft the equal pay legislation. Men, of course, did not want that because it was going to mean that they would lose. And that equal pay legislation, coupled with the other strategies that helped to implement it, made it possible. We're not quite there, but it's made it possible for us to achieve a position that is better than where we would have been without it. We need to recognize the importance of leadership, and we are doing that in Wales as well. We are asking leaders to include being anti-racist or leading anti-racist organizations in their key performance indicators. I was very, very pleased when my discussions with the Permanent Secretary of Wales led to the Permanent Secretary including leading anti-racist organization into initially the key performance indicator of the previous Permanent Secretary, and then the new Permanent Secretary has also taken that on board, which has been very positive in our work here in Wales. We must develop that mechanism that make institutions accountable on race equality. The legislation is there. It is not to do Black and minority ethnic people a favor of some sort. It is just asking people to comply with the legislation that already exists. Organizations can also help by adopting best practice approaches. You look at how you can undertake an equality audit. You look at how you set aspirational targets and use positive actions. You make sure that your HR decisions are not based on some of these subjectivities. When people are allowed not to give jobs to people because their personalities don't fit, and so on and so forth. We think about information and data and having the appropriate data to be able to analyze these things. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to conclude now by saying to you that racism is a terrible, terrible thing for any human being to have to go through. Research that is emerging is now telling us that racism is linked directly to mental health. People who are subjected to repeated experiences of racism can die young, or they would age prematurely. And that is not something anybody wants to be in a position to have in their lives. And so what we're saying in Wales is that we have a wonderful opportunity now to create anti-racism. And it is something that we intend to take advantage of, because it's either we do it now or we may never have this opportunity again where we are talking about race and racism. So for this research we're doing around this, the next step is for us to get a doctoral research student to come and work with us in the Welsh government and to try and document some of the things that we are doing, and so also that we'll be able to develop somebody in that direction, so that when we are long gone, there will be other people that will continue the struggle. Thank you very much for listening.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti, Emmanuel. Thanks so much. And that emphasis at the end on the very trauma experienced by victims of racism is well made, and underlies the desperate need to eradicate exactly what Emmanuel is talking about, operating in visible and invisible ways, obviously, as we know. I'd like to move to the question and answer session now, if I may, and if you haven't already inputted a question, now's the time to do so. And I'd like to welcome again Isadora. Warm welcome to you. Hi there. And there are some questions that have been submitted in advance, and they're very, very interesting. So I'll take those first as some more questions are fed in, if I may. And I'll feed these to Emmanuel and Isadora, but feel free, both of you, to be proactive in jumping to answer the question as I articulate it. One perhaps for Emmanuel to begin with. You subtitled the presentation "A Welsh Example." Now, obviously, there's a particular Welsh context in relation to the Welsh Government prompt and the invitation to you, which we're very proud of, as I said at the beginning. It would be dangerous and fatuous and incorrect to say that Wales is less or more racist than any other section of the United Kingdom. My question is, what is your experience of Wales in this journey towards anti-racism? What is it about, if anything, about Welsh culture in all its diversity that is both a help and a hindrance, do you think, to changing the culture?
Okay, thank you very much for that. My view is that Wales is a very welcoming society, and I have found that to be the case in the time that I have lived here, which is going back to the mid-1980s. And I moved to Wales from London, having spent 3 years in London, in England. So I found Wales to be a very welcoming society. But one of the things that has helped us a lot is the fact that in this work is the fact that we have had political, if you like, patronage, in the sense that the Welsh government and the Welsh Assembly hasn't made this a matter of politics. I am not aware of any of the political parties in Wales that has been against the work that we've been doing, and that has made it much easier for us to be able to do this work, perhaps in Wales, than in England. And I can see a question there that hints at the civil report. There is nothing political about the work we are doing. We've been allowed as academics to conduct our research and to come up with our conclusions. And those conclusions are what you see in both the reports and that I've tried to summarize today. What aspect of the Welsh society have made it difficult? I would say that Wales ultimately would share similarities in terms of the effects of ancestral advantages and the impacts of those on outcomes. So people don't always see how those things are operating. They don't always see how other people who may not share those ancestral advantages may be disadvantaged in some of the things that they do, whether it is in organizations or whether it is in everyday society. And as such, when you are working with people who have those advantages, they tend to make certain assumptions which may be unhelpful at times.
Great, thank you very much. An interesting question here that will key the discussion into the particular challenges of the last 2 years as well, which is, you mentioned this, Emmanuel, in your talk. Maybe a question for Isadora. What can you identify a challenge and an opportunity for race relations or anti-racism resulting from the pandemic? That's an interesting question.
I think in the pandemic, a lot of people at first retreated within themselves and weren't as social, but then there was an opportunity there for communities and people to talk to each other that don't normally talk to each other through these virtual events and things like that. And I've noticed, because I'm also a Cardiff University BAME wellbeing champion, I've noticed that people who don't belong to the BAME community started sometimes showing up to some of our events, just learning different things. And I think the biggest way to tackle a lot of racism is just contact with each other, is because at the end of the day, everyone's a human being. And once you start to talk to people and break down those barriers, I think that's where the opportunity lies.
Thanks, Isadora. Interesting question, central one, obviously, because of the complexity of the issue. That idea of intersectionality, the question here about intersectionality of institutional racism and issues such as homophobia. Any comments, either of you?
Yeah, intersectionality, I think, is an important thing to think about when one is looking at racism, or indeed any area of injustice. We try to do this in our work, the recognition that no individual has a single identity and that we are multifaceted in our identities. But what I like to think about is that one has to consider the idea that there may well be some aspects of identity that may reflect base identities. So race, I always see as one of those, and I think a key base identity, in the sense that you could have somebody who's discriminated against. They can be everything, but if they are also Black or Asian or Arab or whatever, that adds a different layer to their discrimination. And that is one of the reasons I always advocate that we study race closely as a key base identity in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Question for Isadora. How do we avoid tokenism?
I think when you're putting together anything, there's sometimes the sense of, oh, someone's just been thrown in. To avoid that, really, you need to think about why you're putting them there. If it's just to check a box, rather than to implement changes and make real differences to the way EDI works in that sense, then there's no point having them there, because people can tell when it's tokenism. I think that is quite a complex question, actually, because the answer varies depending on what you're doing. So to avoid tokenism, you need to look at whatever you're trying to do and implement a strategy for that particular thing, if whether it be putting together a group or trying to make policy changes, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. An interestingly specific scenario here. Question: How do you broach this scenario? A colleague raises their experience of racism, and a white colleague investigates this by only asking white colleagues what happened. How do you point this out without calling them a racist?
Sorry, I think that is that. This is, I guess, one of the problems that organizations, and many organizations, have. If somebody narrates their experience to a manager or a colleague, and then you investigate those colleagues, the problem, and you don't speak to the person, then essentially what you're doing is you are replicating this notion of a racist institution that deals within racist institution in that sense, because the person that is impacted by this behavior has not been invited, but they should be invited. Their experience should be heard. Even if you don't think it makes sense to you, it does make sense to them. And that is one of the key reasons racism continues to exist, because it is very difficult for white people to understand what racism is, because it's not an experience they share. It's not an experience they've ever had. If you ever ask a white person to tell you how racism has ever impacted on their lives, they can't, because it's never impacted on their lives.
Quite
but
right.
Say that to a Black person or an ethnic minority person, they will.
Yeah, quite right. Isadora, a couple more questions. Should we be teaching whiteness and its impact in schools?
I think one has to be quite careful here, because you don't want to create divisionism at a school age and at that level, because a lot of the time children are quite innocent and a lot of them don't have a racist bone or any racism inbuilt. So I think one needs to broach that carefully, and rather than just teaching about whiteness per se, just a more accurate reflection on history and how that may impact how society treats certain demographics today. I think that's important, but I wouldn't stress the differences between pupils, because that would be alienating and I think cause more issues than solutions.
And on the question of history, one for you, Emmanuel, you mentioned, this is from Matthew Robinson, you mentioned the importance of looking into the past as a strategy towards changing hearts and minds. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So when you look at some of the things that is emerged from the recent work that the Welsh government has been doing, you see the Professor Williams report that talks about teaching history in schools. So Wales has been the first country to adopt that in this part of the world. And what that does is it teaches young people, as Isadora was saying, about the history of the people that they are going to be with, that they are going to be growing up with, so that they can understand how and why it is that some of these people happen to come to this country. There are so many people in this country believe that every Black and minority ethnic person they see is an asylum seeker, is coming to take over their jobs or their housing or whatever the case may be. Not to say that there are no asylum seekers. They do exist, and we have a legal obligation to help them. But there are also so many people that were invited here by the British that have been here for a very, very long time, and trying to get a measure of that history to young people may begin to change their views and their attitudes towards these people in the future. And I think it's important for us to look at that as well when we are trying to change behaviors.
Yeah. Couple more questions. Time is not on our side, but any best practice for incorporating EDI into admissions processes for universities? Big question. Yeah,
it's a big question. But I think universities would have to look at schools and colleges that they are recruiting from, and try harder to recruit from inner city schools and colleges where ethnic minority youngsters tend to be. I think they need to look at different ways of measuring the success of people. Also look at how they offer opportunities to people when they do come into their institutions. And I think there are some good examples of those that are already happening in Cardiff and elsewhere.
Thank you. And on the question of measuring success, we've got about 5 minutes left. The issue of KPIs, a couple of questions coming in about KPIs. Isadora, how do you measure anti-racist KPIs?
I think this is one where obviously statistics and having a look at the changes in measurable things is important, but as well when it comes to racism, you need to look at lived experiences as well. You cannot discount that. And I think getting the feel of how it's improving for minorities, their experiences, and a lot of the time in white majority countries, white people don't tend to experience racism, but if their spouse is an ethnic minority or their good friends are, sometimes they themselves can see it. So even their gauge of what's changing and how that's happening, I think having a qualitative approach sometimes, it combined with a quantitative approach, is a more robust than just purely going quantitative, because that will not give the full picture.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Two more questions, if I may. One from TJ. Are there any oft-recurring issues which appear in institutional race equality audits?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Are there any
often recurring issues that appear in institutional race equality audits? Do the same things tend to come out round and round?
Yes, I would say so. The one thing that you would tend to find is the absence of data. Organizations don't hold and haven't traditionally worked hard to try and generate data on ethnicity. It hasn't been important, and they haven't had it. So that is very important. Another thing that emerges often is this idea of talking about race and creating an environment where people feel comfortable and talking about the issues that concern race, because these issues have been suppressed for so long. And in fact, in many instances, if you started it in Cardiff or any other place today, it will struggle to get people to come out and talk about it, because people are frightened. They don't actually believe often that what you're trying to do is to make things better for them. And as such, they won't even give you their data or declare their ethnicity. So there are some of these areas, and I think there are so many issues that are recurring, but these are that I can think of immediately.
Yeah. Thank you. And final question, if I may, for Isadora. Two very high-profile examples of institutionally racist organisations: Yorkshire Cricket and the Met Police, Isadora. They're having to implement high-profile strategies to tackle racism. How successful do you think they'll be? Do you have any key tips for them?
My observation, especially with the police, was they let a culture develop where racism was okay, where they thought they could get away with it. So I think unless they really crack down on that behavior, changing that behavior, then hearts and minds won't change unless the behavior modifies first, I think, because trying to convince people to treat people equally, even though one would think it'd be a natural, easy thing to do, for some reason, it's not as easy as one would think. So my top tip, as it were, would be to just really implement stringent rules and consequences, because if it's always just, oh, smack on the wrist and no real consequences for offenders, then there's not going to be that modification of behavior, which will then keep the culture and ethos as is, and there won't be any significant improvement.
Thank you, and the Mets being a horrific example of what we were talking about in intersectionality, with other stories, of course, violence against women, very much in the news, unfortunately. We are out of time, folks. Emmanuel and Isadora, thank you so much for joining us, talking about your research and your experiences. Ni'n ddiolchgar iawn i chi. Can I thank you as webinar audience for tuning in? And if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we will respond to them by email. Final couple of things. As I said at the top, you will receive an email later this week with a copy of the recording and links to register for upcoming events. And as I said at the beginning, you can share that link. And our next event in this series, taking place on the Thursday, the 24th of March is the next date. We'll hear about work undertaken in Cardiff by my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Purcell and Dr. Jen Keating, to understand developmental coordination disorder, otherwise known as dyspraxia. We hope that you can join us for that. If anybody watching or listening would like to get involved with Cardiff University or volunteer time to help our students or help us fundraise for our research, please follow the link that is available there in the chat. And that leads me to say thank you and goodbye. Diolch yn fawr iawn, hwyl fawr i chi. We hope to see you again on the 24th of March. Diolch i chi.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.